So you've probably heard of oxytocin, right? It gets tossed around a lot. People call it the love hormone or even liquid trust. And the idea sounds pretty simple, you know? A little splash of this chemical and suddenly we're all best friends, more bonded, more connected, more trusting. But is it really that simple? I mean, can something as big and messy as human trust really be boiled down to a single molecule? Today, we're going to unpack the real science behind oxytocin and figure out what's myth and what's the real story.
All right, let's get right to the heart of it with a huge question. Is our ability to trust a total stranger something we just learn from experience? Or is it, kind of hardwired into our biology? It's a big one. And it turns out studies on twins have hinted that trust is at least partly heritable. That means there's likely a genetic piece of the puzzle that helps decide how willing you are to put your faith in somebody else. And, well, that idea sent scientists on this really fascinating hunt for a direct link somewhere in our DNA.
Okay, so if you're going to test a biological link, you've got to have a solid way to actually measure trust, right? Because you can't just go up to someone and ask, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how trusting are you? And expect a real, objective answer. It just doesn't work that way. Scientists needed something standardized, something they could put numbers to, something they could repeat. And that's where this clever thing called the trust game comes in.
Now, the real genius of this game is how it takes this really complex social thing, trust, and boils it down to a simple, measurable economic choice. And look, this game isn't really about the money. It's a carefully designed experiment. It's all about measuring how willing a person is to make themselves vulnerable, to take a risk for the chance of a mutual reward. So the more cash that first player, the investor, sends over, the bigger the act of trust.
So it all comes down to that first decision by the investor. Think about it. Sending more money is a huge act of trust, but it's also a massive risk. I mean, if they send all their money and the other person, the trustee, decides to just keep it all, they're left with nothing. Zip. But if the trustee plays fair and sends some back, they can both walk away with more than they started with. And that one simple choice, how much to risk, is just a brilliant way to put a number on a social behavior like trust. All right, so now that we have a way to measure trust, scientists could finally start connecting that behavior to our biology. And since oxytocin was already this prime suspect for social stuff, they zoomed right in on the gene that builds its receptor. The easiest way to think about it is like a key and a lock. Oxytocin is the key, and the receptor is the lock on our brain cells. If you don't have the right lock, the key is pretty much useless. And this is where it gets incredibly specific. That OXTR gene, it literally holds the blueprint for that little docking station. Researchers zeroed in on one tiny spot in that gene, a variation called RS53576. Basically, at this one spot, you can have one of two letters, either a G or an A. And pretty much all of us have some combination of those two. Which leads to the huge central question of a major study. Could this one tiny, single-letter difference in just one gene actually predict how people behave in the trust game? Could our DNA really, truly predispose us to be more or less trusting of other people? Well, the results were pretty stunning. When they looked at the data from the trust game, they found that people with two copies of that G letter, the GG genotype, sent on average 14% more money than people who had at least one A letter. This was a huge deal. It looked like a direct link between one little genetic variation and how much you trust someone. Okay, so we've got a genetic link. That's one piece of the puzzle. But remember, the gene is just the blueprint for the receptor. What about the actual chemical itself? Let's zoom out from the DNA for a second and look at what oxytocin is actually doing in the brain. So what even is oxytocin? It's this powerful little molecule, a neuropeptide, made deep inside the brain in a place called the hypothalamus. And it's a real multitasker. It works as a hormone traveling all through your bloodstream, but it also acts as a neurotransmitter, sending signals right inside the brain. It's famous for its role in social bonding, like between a mom and her baby. And for researchers, a really cool thing is that they can give it to people directly, usually with a nasal spray, to see what happens. And this is where the different lines of evidence started to line up. In a really famous study from 2005, scientists gave participants a puff of oxytocin up the nose. And what happened? They showed way more trust in the game. They sent significantly more money over to the other player compared to people who just got a placebo. So it wasn't just the gene, the chemical itself seemed to be causing the trusting behavior. So how does it do that? Well, a leading theory is that oxytocin kind of turns down the volume on our brain's fear center, the amygdala. Think about it. Trusting someone is risky, right? You're making yourself vulnerable.
So by quieting down those danger signals from the amygdala, oxytocin might just lower our social anxiety, making it a little easier to take that leap of faith. Okay, so we've got a really neat story so far. There's a gene for trust receptors, there's a chemical that boosts trust by making us less afraid. It all fits together perfectly. But in science, whenever things seem a little too perfect, they usually are. And that's exactly what happened here. Get ready for the plot twist. This created a huge puzzle for scientists. On one hand, you have a study saying that if you give people oxytocin, it causes them to be more trusting. But then, another study found that when someone shows you trust, your own oxytocin levels go up, which then makes you act in a more trustworthy way. So, which is it? Is oxytocin the cause of trust, or is it the effect? It's a real chicken and egg problem. This inconsistency drove researchers crazy for years. Why were the results all over the place? Well, this quote from a researcher named Yina Ma gives us a hint. Maybe the problem isn't what oxytocin does to us, but how it interacts with who we already are, and specifically, our style of thinking. And this is where it gets really nuanced, and frankly, super interesting. Ma's research discovered that oxytocin's effect was totally different depending on a person's thinking style. For people who are intuitive thinkers, they go with their gut, oxytocin actually made them favor their own group more. But for reflective thinkers, the people who are more analytical, it did the exact opposite. It decreased their bias. This is huge. It shows oxytocin isn't some magic one-size-fits-all trust potion. Its effect completely depends on how your brain is already wired to work. So the main takeaway here is that human trust is incredibly complicated. The trust game is a great tool, but it's a very simple model. In real life, people's choices are shaped by things like altruism or just not liking to see things be unfair. And we also have this powerful thing called betrayal aversion. Basically, the emotional pain of being betrayed by a person feels way worse than just losing the same amount of money in a game of chance. Trust is personal. And to top it all off, some massive studies that pulled together data from lots of different experiments have actually found no consistent solid effect of oxytocin at all. The picture is messy. Now, with all this complexity, all these contradictions, you might be thinking, okay, so why does any of this even matter? Well, trying to understand the biology behind our social behavior, even with all these nuances, has some really profound implications for the future. For one, this research could open a door to helping with mental health conditions that involve social difficulties, like social anxiety or autism spectrum disorder. Getting a handle on how the oxytocin system works, and crucially, how it's different for different people, is a vital first step. But the big lesson from all this is that any potential therapy would have to be super personalized. The same treatment could literally have opposite effects on different people. So we started this journey with a simple, neat idea of a love hormone. But what we've actually found is something way more fascinating. Trust isn't some simple switch that gets flipped by a chemical. It's more like a delicate, complex dance between our unique genes, our brain chemistry, our individual personalities, and the world around us. The simple myth just doesn't hold up, but the reality is so much more interesting. And that brings us to one last, really provocative thought to leave you with. As we get better and better at understanding this complex dance, we're also getting closer to maybe being able to influence it. But if we could, one day, actually tune the biology of trust, the real question isn't could we, it's should we.